Hello. In episode 130 of Heirs for Architecture, I spoke with Tom Morton, founder of Arc Architects, an environmentally orientated practice in Fife in Scotland, about his practice's work, but particularly about Earthbound Orkney, the work that he and Becky Little have undertaken in Orkney, which aims to highlight the rich cultural heritage and stunning landscapes of the Orkney Islands. Tom describes how art and architecture can serve as a catalyst for environmental awareness and community connection, helping cultivate a deeper appreciation for our planet and the stories that shape it.
Heirs for Architecture, a podcast about architecture, buildings, urban culture and space.
Hello and welcome to another episode of Heirs for Architecture. I'm talking today to Tom Morton, Director, Principal of Arc Architects based in Cooper in Fife in Scotland. Tom, I wanted to speak to you for a while. We've been trying to organise this for a long time, but before we get into it, would you be so kind as to introduce yourself, please?
Yeah, so there's maybe two introductions. I'll tell you what I am, and then I'll try and explain who I am, maybe. So what I am is I carry the cloak of being an architect, and I lead a practice of 7 architects in Cooper and Fife. But I'm also a director of the Scottish Ecological Design Association and of Earthbuilding UK and Ireland, and I'm convener of Co-Housing Scotland. So I've got a few different hats in and around the built environment, either in practice or through third sector charities. And that's the sort of formal stuff. But I guess, you know, the who am I and why am I wearing those hats is kind of, you know, my journey into and through architecture. You know, when I was 17 and the age of my sons now, and thinking, what did I want to do with my life? I kind of really, you know, I would have liked to have gone to art college and studied art and become a sculptor or something, but I didn't. I didn't think that was had enough social purpose in it. You know, my father was a minister and the son of a minister and born in China, and my mother was American, and it had a sort of I guess a Christian socialist upbringing, which maybe came through in them. And then I went away and I thought architecture, you know, had some art within it, but also carried some social purpose. And I went through, you know, the process of becoming educated and going into practice, and perhaps realized over the years that quite a lot of architecture doesn't really have a lot of social purpose, or very much art in it either. But sometimes that takes a few decades to realize. So yeah, went to Edinburgh, studied there, and I guess you know, principally under Izzy Metstein, the great old modernist, as our professor when we were there in senior years, and then off into practice. Did my year out in America for one of Charles Moore's sort of offshoot practices, Centerbrook, and spent a bit of time in California as well. And then came back, and it was I guess we graduated 89, something like that, when things weren't great in terms of the economy, and all my friends seemed to be going off to Hong Kong or Berlin and so on. But I didn't, you know, I'd been abroad, didn't really fancy that. So I stayed in Scotland. I went to work for Howard Liddell at Gaia when they were still up in Aberfeldy. And I guess I got, you know, an education in environmental design, which had always interested me there. And then moved down to Edinburgh, worked for a Rum Jum for a while, one of these big Edinburgh establishment practices, and got a slightly different education there. Ended up they somehow managed to get a series of jobs at Edinburgh Castle. They weren't a, you know, conservation practice at all, but somehow they got a contract for a whole bunch of work at Edinburgh Castle, and they put me onto it as a, you know, not yet fully qualified architect. And then when, you know, the project architect went to go to Hawaii, and I ended up, as we said before, I was entirely fully qualified at the age of 25. Running £1 million job at Edinburgh Castle. But those were the days when you could do that sort of thing, and the profession was perhaps a little kinder to its junior staff. And also, you know, the castle at that time was still a military encampment run by the army, and Historic Scotland, you know, still carried all their traditional practice and knowledge within them. and so I kind of learnt my trade working in Edinburgh Castle in terms of old things. But then Rumdrum, had a bit of a bumpy ride through the 90s, and I got jettisoned in one of those recessions, and I'd been doing bits and pieces on the side, and so I just kind of carried on with that, and then found I didn't actually need to go and work for somebody else because I was busy enough doing things that people wanted me to do, and so I kind of stumbled into being a sole practitioner, working out of my bedroom, and then gradually I needed other people to come along and help me because I wasn't able to do it all. And here we are, 25 years later, and managed to stay solvent and train up a few other architects and build a few things along the way. And that's really my journey through architecture profession.
That's already
so far.
So far, yeah, you're young yet. I think you're what they might call an enfant terrible in architecture. I think you can be an enfant terrible until you're about 60. So I think you've got some time.
Yes.
I came across you through Becky Little,
Yes.
who I have spoken to before with regards to this podcast, actually, something that didn't quite come off. But I had seen a post in which I think you were tagged about your work up in Orkney that you've been doing together. And I know that yesterday, I think you said you were doing a talk on that. I was wondering if you could perhaps talk a little about that work and I suppose how that came about and its relationship to your broader practice as an architect.
Okay, well, I'll try and explain myself. It's as I said in the talk last night, it's been one of these projects that we hang with the tag "everything, everywhere, all at once," because we were deliberately experimenting with different kind of processes, but it was also bringing together a lot of different aspects of our emerging practice, and they kind of distilled in this project, I think. And just for clarification, then Becky is my better half and life partner and the mother to my children, but she's also she is a traditional craftsperson and trained through heritage, but also an eco builder and now a trainer and an artist and so on in her own right. So I kind of
well, now we know. Now we know.
And we work together. Sometimes, her business employs me as an architect. Sometimes I employ her as a builder. Sometimes we collaborate together, and we both work for some of these third sector organizations. So we've got, a relationship that seems horribly confused to people on the outside, but to us makes perfect sense. And at least we understand what each other's doing.
Yeah.
And that is perhaps the key to a long-term relationship. Anyway, Orkney. So Orkney,
this is the project Earthbound Orkney.
So this is the project Earthbound Orkney, which so we both have an interest in earth as a material. I think as a practice we're interested in materiality per se, but also as a vehicle to delivering a more sustainable construction sector. And so we've both been working with earth materials in terms of conservation of built heritage, vernacular construction in Scotland, but really globally as well through European networks and in America, also for 20, 25 years, but also in developing new sustainable construction of using unfired clay as a binder through a series of industrial collaboration projects and so on. So we've got a background in earth as a material, and there's a whole thing about our vernacular traditions and how with Scotland and Britain having such a loss of its traditional forms of construction in the 18th and 19th century. And people always forget this. We lost so much of our traditional building stock, and we lost so many of our skills and materials knowledge in that period in a way that a lot of other countries didn't, because we had industrialization, we had rural depopulation, we had the transport of materials through trains and so on, all happening very quickly, and emigration as well, of course, in Scotland. And we really lost a lot of our traditional knowledge of materiality, the embedding of skills within local regions, traditional forms of architecture on a bioregional basis, and that connection, I guess, ultimately of people with place expressed through architectural culture. And so we've been working with Historic Environment Scotland for a number of years to recover some of that traditional knowledge, both through the repair of vernacular buildings and through research projects. And they developed a national materials strategy in terms of traditional earth materials in order to assess the current state of knowledge, skill and competence within the sector. And we did a scoping study looking at that. And two of the 29 recommendations, one was to develop better skill and knowledge within the archaeological community, and the other was to understand more what was going on in prehistory. And so we went to Orkney with this project to do that. And because I don't know, do you know Orkney? It's an extraordinary place.
I've never had the chance to go, unfortunately.
So Orkney, it's this archipelago of 72 islands and skerries off the north coast of Scotland, and geologically, 500 million years ago, it was south of the equator and was this great basin of decayed rock that turned into a massive sandstone slabs, which are these Caithness slabs that it's quite famous for. But it gradually drifted, to the northern hemisphere, and then was kind of squeezed between the glaciers of the north of Scotland and Scandinavia, 10,000, 12,000 years ago, and got covered with this layer of clay soil, and then being populated for 10, 12,000 years by people. And had a really interesting cultural development and flowering in the Neolithic, because it was kind of at the crossroads of the Celtic population moving up the west coast of Europe and connection to north of Europe and Scandinavia on the other side, at a time when water navigation was really key. And so I had this incredible flowering during the Neolithic era, and because it is relatively undeveloped by industry and so on, it has substantial surviving remains which have stayed in place and studied by archaeologists for 150 years. So I think what they say is there's more archaeologists per square meter in Orkney than anywhere else in the world. So there's a community we could work with there, as well as a fantastic surviving heritage. The oldest house in Europe, the Nap of Howard, and the oldest surviving settlement in Europe at Skara Brae, among many other substantial monumental remains. So we went there to have a look about, and we're not archaeologists, which is a great strength when you're going to deal with archaeologists, because you're not competing from a knowledge base, and you can just absorb what everybody else thinks. And they're fascinating as a community of knowledge, archaeologists, to compare them with architects. And so we've been going up there for 2 or 3 years, doing quite a lot of field research, as well as interviewing a whole bunch of the most eminent archaeologists in their field. And with this project, we were trying to do that bridging with the archaeological community, and to share our perspective as an architect, vernacular conservation architect, and as a traditional builder, and as researchers, with our perspective on the earth material culture that I think has been rather neglected in its understanding and celebration. So you can maybe link to the film and the information about the project, but we studied the materials there, and we came. It was really quite important from us in terms of a lot of things coming together, and maybe making a bit of a step change in our understanding of our practice going forward. I think so. There's maybe two key things to look at in that, right, because we were interested right back at the start of when we started making permanent buildings in Scotland, 5,000-6,000 years ago. What was the relationship of people to place and their natural environment that brought about how we started constructing permanent buildings. And that's what we're really interested in. So we were interested in looking technically at the monuments and how they were made and the materials and so on. But also we were interested in the intangible culture, the skills and knowledge and relationship of people to place, and how that came about. Because it's quite hard to reach beyond that into the Mesolithic, which is another podcast discussion. And I guess at that same time, at the start of this year, I was leading a series of 5 days events funded by the Scottish Government, bringing together people across the construction sector, looking at the challenge of the just transition to net zero. That, those were great conversations, but they were there was quite a lot of difficult conversations went on, and that, we're not in a very good place with where we need to be. And I had some conversations during that with some climate scientists about, really what the projections are and what is coming, over the next 20, 100 years. That, slightly traumatized me and gave me a decent dose of climate anxiety. And so it was interesting at that time to be working in Orkney and looking right back to the start of constructing permanent buildings, which helps, gain perspective on some of these things. And so we looked at these buildings, and of course we found, earth mortared masonry as a tradition that goes from right back then, 4,000 BC, right through till the end of the vernacular, 1850 or so, as a kind of a continuity. And through all those cultural and architectural changes, different forms and typology, the relationship of material, of where they were getting the materials and how they were making their buildings, the craft skills and so on, were essentially one big continuity. And fantastic earth floors. I think the oldest clay plasters in Britain there from Crossy Crown, pigmented plasters, red and grey plasters, roof tiles bedded in clay, underground drainage, waterproof with clay, really, really quite sophisticated buildings using a very limited palette of materials. And what that tells you is they had developed a high degree of skill, both in the understanding of the different material qualities of clay and how to achieve different aesthetic and technical performances, but also to understand how the earth sits in the landscape and how you can procure different materials from different places. And of course, with the Neolithic, they have these sort of slightly patriarchal terms of defining ages of progress, through the Stone Ages and into the Metal Ages and so on. But really, that's just because they like looking at stones and bits of pots, and all the biodegradable stuff has disappeared, because there was far much more wood and leather and iron materials than there was stone in these times. But the thing about the Neolithic, it's those three things. It's when we started making permanent buildings where earth was a fundamental part of that making. But it was also the start of agriculture, and you need to know your soils if you're going to grow plants and manage beasts, and also pottery. Those are the three totems of the Neolithic, and they all involve a relationship to earth, an understanding of its physical properties, how it sits within a landscape, and how you can work with them to achieve different things. So I guess we became aware that these things of relationship of people to place in the art of making, and that architecture is part of that expression, and that you can read it all, in the surviving landscape of Orkney. And so that tradition carried right on, until 1850, 1900 or so, when the materials started being imported, and we started to lose our vernacular traditions. But there was this point at the Second World War, the First World War and the Second World War, when Orkney was a real military important place because of its geographical position. And so it had this huge influx of military construction. And they built, there was a lot of naval activity there, and submarine sinking ships and so on. And they built these incredible protective structures and huge huge barriers between islands made out of concrete, these cubes of concrete that they constructed to stop submarines penetrating, and to thereby, and it brought in a new material technology of concrete to the islands that hadn't really had it before. And a huge amount of concrete was constructed in these often quite geometric military fortifications. And it changed the architecture of the islands. And ever since then, the buildings have been dominated by a construction of concrete. And now you look at new houses and they're made from concrete blocks and synthetic tiles and plastic windows and, foam insulation. And so the material culture of architecture on the islands has nothing to do with the place. They come from God knows where, and there's no relationship to that in the place where the buildings exist, and you've lost that connection of people to place. But that the pivot point was the military, the expenditure of military construction in the two wars, and in the same way that happened in Iceland after the Second World War, when there was a huge amount of expenditure on military fortifications for the Cold War by the Americans, fundamentally changed the nature of the construction sector in Iceland. Very similar thing than in Orkney, in a way that didn't quite happen so intensely in other places. Anyway, and so there was a thing there both about the material, the concrete, and the geometric forms of the military fortifications, and particularly these cubes to make the barriers. And then when you look back, you can see in the Neolithic, there's the same combination of material and form, in that quite often the structures they were building had a round external form, both the buildings and indeed the tombs, like Maze Howe and so on, but a square internal form. And so there's this conversation between a rectilinear form and a curved form within the Neolithic. And there's lots of discussion and interpretations about what these things can mean, but it is part of the sophistication of the architecture. In that, are you designing a space or are you creating an object? And is what happens inside, is the internal conversation, is your inner life different from your outside expression? And there was a thing going on there, a conversation through architectural form in the Neolithic, and on beyond that's quite interesting. You can relate to other forms of container and buildings, like pots. And the pots, they were used to contain food that nourishes people and to cook and so on, but they also contained ashes. And this relationship of life and death, because we've got monuments, the houses of the dead, and we've got houses of the living. And if architecture is a relational thing, there's a rich sort of series of relational conversations going on in Orkney in the Neolithic to do with people in place. And we just kept on finding more and more layers when we were looking at this, and more points of connection. They were really interesting. And then, of course, we had to sort of wrap it all up and present it back in some digestible form to as diverse an audience as we could reach. And what we were trying to do with funding from Historic Environment Scotland, from the National Heritage Lottery Fund, from the Society of Antiquaries of Scotland, and with a lot of local partners, including the University of Highlands and Islands, we kind of developed this program of activities to kind of share that knowledge and try and reach as many different people as possible. So we made this exhibition to explain this really through the medium of art. And so we created a series of cubes and spheres from the different soils around the islands and presented them in relationship to a geological map and to some of the Neolithic artifacts. And then we ran training workshops, and we gave a series of public talks, and we wrote a book as well. And I think that sort of loose fit methodology, we were trying different things, allowed us to have a series of conversations that were also, quite productive as well. And so one of the things that so the other thing about the form and material then, apart from the cubes, is the round part, the spheres. And one of the things we didn't expect to find, but that's been recovered on almost every Neolithic domestic site in Orkney, is our collections of little clay balls, unfired clay balls, and which have, it has to be said, not entirely being celebrated by the archaeological community because they're quite modest little things. But of course, we were quite interested in them because I think they were a way of telling a story. And so we went around the various museum collections and looked at those and borrowed some of those for the exhibition, and related them to similar objects that have been found in different cultures. But the interesting thing is that most of them are quite small and not of any great wondrous beauty. But from that, what we interpreted is that most of these were made by children. That you could imagine parents making a pot and the youngsters getting in the way and just giving them a piece of clay to go and play marbles with and do it, and that they'd not any great value and they'd discarded or they'd fallen near a fire and survived to be found by the archaeologists, and it's that thing of the clay material being part of their culture, and from a very early age people were playing with it, manipulating it, and that the intangible heritage of the knowledge and skills and the relationship to the environment is passed down generation through generation, and not just through the construction of great monuments, but through their repair and maintenance, and through play as well. And in these little humble balls, you can sense that communication through time about place. And then when we were up there a couple of years ago, one of our archaeologists said, "Look at this, what we found." And he'd been out with a student on Scale Bay near Skara Brae, and one of his students had found an almost perfect half sphere just falling out of the side of a sand dune next to Skara Brae. So on a site that's designated as Neolithic, and it was an extraordinary thing because about 2 inches across, but really almost perfectly spherical and in very good condition, considering it being in the ground for 5,500 years. And this was of a different order. And what that showed is that, to make something that of that quality, you really need to know your material. So there was a high degree of craft and material knowledge in that. And it was more like something that an expert would do. There's similar things, they're called dorodangos, produced in Japan. There's a whole culture around these, which started off as children's things, as a kind of mindfulness exercise to rub a lump of clay into a perfect sphere. But now it's been taken to a high degree of craft. So along with our cubes of kind of rough earth, of rammed earth, on top of them we placed these polished balls of exactly the same earth to kind of have this conversation to do with the relationship between the hand and the soil, and that of how you can find beauty in something very humble. And I guess where that took us in our practice is this, what I guess is our core thing just now of the relationship of people to nature, and where the architectural profession is in that, which we all know is in a pretty terrible place, and that when you look at where construction is now as a sector, and where it's led us in terms of the destruction of the biosphere. 40% of our carbon emissions come from the built environment, 50% of our solid waste. We consume 3 times more materials than the planet can sustain in Britain, and half of that is construction. And when you look at the graphs of how we get to net zero in a circular economy, half of that is just not building stuff, in that we just need to consume less architecture and buildings, reuse more buildings and materials and so on. And the other half is using, natural, biodegradable, recyclable materials, and getting away from this inheritance of synthetic and often very toxic materials. And you can, when you take 6,000 years of perspective, you can kind of see these things, because in Orkney, which is a particular geography, you can see these things playing out, because all these materials now for construction are imported to Orkney, which makes it very vulnerable as a supply chain going forward, because they're tied to a global supply chain, because they don't produce any of their materials, and they're not, it's not a local skills or manufacturing base. But also, Orkney's got the highest concentration of monuments at risk from climate change, and all their settlements are clustered around the sea. And the projections by the end of next century could be 10 meters of sea level rise, which will, we're going to have a lot of internally displaced climate refugees, never mind ones coming from other countries. And, the way we are now, we've developed through the 20th century such a fixed infrastructure of buildings and roads and engineering. That also makes us vulnerable. So these things, like the military defences of the Second World War, that we see as strengths, and concrete being the strong material, it's actually a weakness. This thing where things you perceive as being strong and defences are actually the things that are threatening you in the long term. And the materials that we see as weak and insubstantial, like earth and fibre, are actually the ones that are enduring, because you can constantly reuse them. They don't require a chemical change or huge amount of energy. They just require an understanding of the material and a certain degree of technique. And so all these things kind of came together, and where we ended up in was a kind of, in that debate about rights of nature, and if our mission, at this time is to if architecture is a relational, practice, and we kind of redefined our practice a couple of years ago from being that we're makers of stuff, and that you measure your success by the numbers of contracts and how big the buildings are. That's not a viable way of defining a profession anymore. It really is about mediating a relationship of people to place, and then that unlocks a whole different skill set and future for architecture, I think. And it can happen at different scales, a family to their home, a community to their settlement. It can be, from a profession to its sector, and it can be, on a global scale as well. And it just opens up a whole landscape of possibility. But if you think about it from a sector point of view of the construction sector and its relationship to nature, we're still carrying all these colonialist, extractive, patriarchal basis of a relationship, and even the terminology we use of land use and natural resources, it's a very colonial sort of mentality that we still have, and ultimately it's threatening us, because we're destroying the earth as a habitat for humans. And but the thing is, all these things that are, a bit grim about construction just now, degradation of nature, even, the mental health within construction, 3 times the suicide. If you're in construction, you're 3 times more likely to die of suicide. And, 48% of people in construction have taken time off because of uncontrollable stress. It's the most gendered sector, only 1% of people are saying women. All these indicators that it's an unhealthy thing. Never mind Grenfell and VOC, all these, whether it's occupational health or occupant health or the health of the planet from the processes that we do, it's an unhealthy relationship all around. But the trick then is to take your weaknesses and make them strengths. So if you can turn that around, because we are all stakeholders in the built environment. We spend 90% of our time in buildings, and everybody relates to the built environment. It means that if we can change that relationship around, so it is a generative and a positive relationship, that's a pathway to really, make progress. And then you identify what are the barriers to making those changes. And so with the Orkney work, where we ended up with this sort of rights of nature debate, in that, what if the rights of nature were recognised within architecture and construction, and we didn't see, the globe that we reside on as a, a material shop to plunder to make stuff, make money. What would that mean? And uh, these rings of concern from sort of Heraclitus and so on, of how you start off. That's another circular geometry, as in the womb, where your consciousness is only yourself, and you spend your life expanding your consciousness through your family and your community and your nation, your organization, and so on. And then the outer ring is the natural world, which breaks down into animals who it's more easy to feel affinity, and then plants and water. And you finally, the outer ring is kind of where you find minerals. And so our whole project has been trying to reach to the very edge, well, perhaps not the edge, but to that, those further regions of being in conversation with earth as a material, and not in a kind of extractive way, but in a respectful way. And there, we've done some work with colleagues. There's a great organization called the Ambassador of the North Sea, which is looking to give a way of representation, political representation for non-human entities. And, some really interesting work going on around that, both, in a cultural context, but also a legal context. And, for example, if Scotland was to write itself a new constitution, would the rights of nature be in there? And how would that affect construction and architecture? So, there's a whole load of statistics around how, the economy of earth and construction and so on. That's quite interesting to engage in, because there's some quite big numbers there that you can take to potential industrial partners and organisations like Zero Waste Scotland and so on. So it's the kind of area where I think architects have quite a diverse skill set, in terms of what we are trained and experienced in doing, from cultural level, technical level, legal, contractual, financial. And that diversity of skill set, I think it can be better applied than it often is in the profession. And so where we are in the practice just now is that's what we're interested in. And, I've always thought of architecture as a creative discipline. And part of that creativity is defining what you are as an architect and what your practice is, between the people that work there. And so we're kind of at this stage now of trying to, continue on this adventure of being an architect in the 21st century, and what that means, in this place at this time, and what is the most useful work we could be doing. Yeah. So that in not quite a nutshell is the Earthbound Orkney in all its rambling beauty.
Yeah, it's amazing. I like this idea of the tactile, the sort of the handcrafted, and it's something that I've spoken to other folk about on this podcast, and it seems quite phenomenological as a kind of perspective. But it does seem to have at its heart, I suppose, something of a spiritual dimension, which I find quite fascinating in an industry that is often characterized, as you say, it's fairly dominated by scientific projections. And I'm thinking here of a particular paper that I teach from, which is by a couple of scholars, one from Lancaster, I would think one from Newcastle, Simon Guy and Graham Farmer, which is called Reinterpreting Sustainable Architecture. And there's a colon and then a subtitle, and I can't remember that quite yet. But they talk about what they call the 6 logics. I think it's 6 logics of sustainable architecture. And one of them is what they call eco-technical or ecotechnic logic, which is the one that kind of dominates this course, really, which is the one which is we're going to be able to resolve the problems of the environment by inventing technologies to ameliorate for our excesses. But fundamentally, the way I see it, at least, is that they are sort of like trying to shop your way out of debt. We're going to technology our way out of a glut of technology. We're going to insulate our way out of a failure of insulation. And one of the other ones is what they call the ecocentric approach, which seems to be what you're talking about, where there's this idea of the earth as a kind of fragile macrobiotic living thing, which has, in a way, I mean, for want of a better word, for want of a more accurate word, I suppose, a soul, and therefore has, as you indicate, forms of rights which are equitable to human rights. Is that right? Is that Am I
I think
understanding?
the issue of rights is really a means towards an end. I think it can be a good road to go down to give you some clarity on your understanding, but it can be a good technique for finding points of traction
Mm,
to deliver change. And delivering change is what we really need to be focusing on now. I
mhm,
think, you know, our problem really isn't our technology. We know what the technical changes we need to do, really, and it's
mhm,
not really money. Our country has never been richer, and we're one of the richest countries in the world. And a lot of that wealth has come from other places and processes that have been damaging. Um, it's really a problem. Our problem is our heads and the way we think, really. And if we can change the way we think, all these things that seem dreadful problems just now, the answers are already there. We know what the changes we need to do. We're just very reluctant to do it because
mhm,
we have cultures and we have patterns of thought
mhm.
and ways of making decisions that aren't leading to successful outcomes. And so, really, I think the problem is really a cultural one, an architectural. There's a difference between architecture as a discipline and construction as an industrial sector. Well, discussion about the differences between those two and how much architecture has been captured by construction, perhaps. But I think architecture has a message to give and a role to play that it hasn't been doing sufficiently. But it's, I think, I think it's important to be clear that we're not doing this. Our enterprise isn't to save nature. Nature will carry on fine by itself,
Mhm.
if humans become extinct. The advantage of looking in a geological time perspective is you kind of see how insignificant a lot of this stuff goes. Species come and go, we get hit by meteorites, life carries on. Do you know what I mean? It's just the tides go up and down. 9,000 years ago, there was an underwater earthquake off Norway that sent a tsunami right across the east coast of Scotland and devastated those communities. But we were Mesolithic then, so we were much more able to adapt and move and recover. We're much more fixed now, and our
Mm,
fixed architecture is our vulnerability in the face of
mm.
climate change. And so it's really about, how we sustain the planet as a home for our species. And we do that by getting back into balance with all the other beings in the biosphere.
Mm.
And that's really, framing the discussion in that way, I think, can be helpful in finding productive way forward because it's easy to get distracted into thinking, oh, we just need the perfect algorithm, or oh, we need the perfect amount of data, or the perfect regulatory change. I think first and foremost we need culture change,
Mm.
and those things are important, but we mustn't neglect the importance of the way we think,
No.
and architecture needs to respond to that seriously.
That's the sort of final question. How does this thinking inflect your own practice with ARC? And how is it received by clients? Because I guess that's the critical thing. Fine words, butter, no parsnips. But, not being able to pitch this to clients or not being received by clients, that's another very complex thing. How do you go about actually engaging your clients in this discussion without scaring them?
Well, there's maybe several things. I think one of an architect's core skills is about presentation. We spend, 90% of what we do is communication, isn't it?
Hmm.
Whether it's through drawing, through emails, or through phone conversations. And so the art of communication, I always encourage my colleagues in the practice to remember that communication is the most important skill of an architect. And those are skills to be developed. But I think it's important for an architectural practice to understand what its purpose is, and the more you can be clear about what your intent is of what you're trying to achieve, both generally and on an individual project, the easier it becomes to achieve that, and the stronger the team will become and the more cohesive. And what I've found, and I'm not professing to be any kind of commercial genius in this, but somehow I've managed to stay solvent for 25 years. I think, if you define what you're about, the clients that value that will come to you, and the services and skills you have and can provide are the ones that your client want, and then it really is a co-creative partnership. But we always approach these things as team exercises, and it's a commercial aspect, but it's not a commercial mindset, if I can put it that way.
Mm-hmm.
And in a way, this thing of redefining the role of the architect about really being relationship management opens up all sorts of different projects.
Mm-hmm.
So we're actually building big things is often not the outcome that's desirable. And what it allows us to do is have really quite a broad range of projects on our books. So we have specialist knowledge in conservation and in sustainable design, but we've been actively involved in research, for 25 years, both industrial and sort of cultural. And we are involved in projects like the Earthbound Orkney one, delivering training, and so on, and the big conversation, these partnership projects. And I think that gives you a lot more flexibility. The broader the range of projects you can get involved in delivering, the more flexible and resilient it makes you financially. And you start to develop relationships with other consultants and areas of knowledge that architects often don't get involved in. I think often architects box themselves into quite a small world when their skills are really much more broadly applicable. And you see architects fleeing the profession and to take their skills to more comfortable arenas. But I think the world's your oyster as an architect, and it's the time to be imaginative and purposeful about that, because we need new visions, we need good communication, and we need to change the profession, and we need to change the sector. And it's not easy and straightforward, but I think it's the work that we need to be doing. What is it? In 2026, the UK construction sector will have used up all the carbon it was able to use to stay within its share of 1.5 degrees. And, there's a conversation to be had in the practice about, right, so from 2026, do we only do zero carbon construction projects? Because we've had our share of the world's resources. And what would that do to the practice? And what would it do to our projects? We need to get serious about this stuff, I think. So it's time for creative imagination. And, maybe we will be out of business in 5 years, but the future is an uncertain thing.
It is indeed. That's a great point to finish on. Thank you ever so much, Tom. It was lovely to hear you talk.
Thank you.
Again, rejoicing nature sees her robe assume its vernal hues. Her leafy locks wave in the breeze, all freshly steeped in morning dews. That's Robbie Burns, serenading nature. So there's heritage, of course, to Tom and Becky's work in Orkney. Thanks to Tom for taking the time to speak with me, late in the evening as it was. It was a real pleasure and a joy. Please see the podcast descriptions for links to Arc Architects' website and to the Earthbound Orkney project too, and Tom's social media. And thanks for listening.